The Forbidden City, mysterious to all but a few. The gilded home of China's last great regents. Whose stories are as phenomenal as the palaces themselves. Almost 1,000 buildings were once the beating heart of the nation. Where the finest minds were summoned to help run empires. Where the most desirable women in China were kept hidden. Common men sacrificed everything to survive. Behind the walls of the Forbidden City was a secret, enigmatic world with its own set of rules. At 72 hectares, the Forbidden City is the largest palace complex in the world. Home to China's royal dynasties for the last 5 centuries of imperial rule. Emperors and their families lived here. But it was made 600 years ago for just one man. The formidable Emperor Yongle of the Ming Dynasty. But he wasn't the one intended for the throne. In 1398, Yongluo's father, Emperor Hongwu, died. Yongluo's nephew, Jianwen, had been named as heir. And when Jianwen became emperor and took control of the empire, Yongluo felt cheated of the power he thought rightfully his. The injustice was too much. He led his forces from his northern base, then known as Beiping, south to the ancient capital of Nanjing, with plans to kill his nephew just 2 years into his reign. To be those of the Emperor, the Empress, and their 6-year-old son. Confused by the fire, but assuming that his plan had been a success, Yongluo declared himself the new emperor. But rumors were circulating that it was in fact Jianwen who had set the blazes, sacrificing his family to the inferno before fleeing in disguise. The possibility haunted Yongluo as he grew paranoid that his cousin would return to reclaim the empire. Insecure of his hold on the throne, he did all that he could to assert his power. beginning with the murder of tens of thousands of people, purging Nanjing of anyone that might stand in his way. He moved the ancient capital of 6 dynasties, from Nanjing to his home of Beiping, 900 kilometers to the north. It would now be known as Yongle was also fledging a vast naval fleet of 3,500 ships. Some were well over 100 meters long, dwarfing the biggest Europe had to offer. One of Yongle's trusted officials, Zheng He, commanded what was known as the Treasure Fleet. On 7 ambitious voyages, beginning in 1405, and spanning 3 decades. They traveled as far as Africa, Persia, and the Red Sea. But the motivation wasn't to conquer and colonize, as the Europeans were at the time. The expeditions were instead a show of might, the boats packed full of treasures to show off to other nations. He wanted his empire to be seen as dominant and powerful, the most advanced in the world. As this great show took to the world's oceans, Yongle focused on creating his new home. In 1406, he summoned the best architects and construction teams in China, and work began. But building on the scale he dreamed of was not easy. Even before construction could begin, monumental challenges had to be overcome. The grand design called for the collection of materials from all over Yongle's new empire. Men braved tiger-ridden forests in Sichuan to harvest giant namu trees. The timber was used to make the columns of the main ceremonial hall. After almost 13 years of felling, they were virtually wiped out. The extinction of these slow-growing hardwoods wasn't the only cost. It's thought that of those that entered the forests in search of namu, only half were ever seen again. The logs were so large that the only way they could be moved back to Beijing was by floating them along rivers and canals. A journey of thousands of kilometers across the breadth of the country, sometimes taking several years. But the biggest challenge of all presented itself when sourcing a giant single piece of stone. Weighing 300 tons, it was too heavy to be moved a centimeter, let alone the 70-kilometer journey from the quarry to the new capital. Eventually, a plan was made. to be carried out in the dead of winter. A road was built especially for the job, with wells dug every half a kilometre. Water was then spread across the road. When it froze, the giant stone could slowly be pulled along what became an icy conveyor belt. It took an army of 10,000 labourers, 6,000 troops, and 1,000 mules, 28 days to pull the stone into place. After months of carving, the stone was transformed into a spectacular ceremonial staircase. Over 1 million people worked on the construction of the Forbidden City over 13 years. Together, they completed one of the most impressive building accomplishments of pre-modern China. Finally, in 1420, Yongle had his new home. Like the treasure fleet, the finished palace was a show of power and proof of Yongle's right to the throne. High walls that surrounded it would hold Yongle's secrets and those of the next 23 emperors to live. Despite the blood Yongle shed, life improved under his rule. He strengthened the economy, rebuilt the Grand Canal, and lengthened the Great Wall. But it would seem that his crowning glory, the Forbidden City, was cursed. In 1421, less than 100 days after the palace was inaugurated, violent electric storms hit Beijing. Lightning struck, and 3 great ceremonial halls were set alight. Lit up the city, destroying hundreds of buildings, burning people alive as it spread. The main palace halls were burned to the ground. Years of work and unimaginable expense reduced to ashes. The palace seemed doomed. Yongle was convinced that the fire was a sign from heaven, his punishment for years of brutality. Consumed by fear and paranoia, the emperor's spirit was broken. He was overcome soon after, in battle against the Mongols. and ambitious rule. For 276 years, the Ming Dynasty shaped China into a global superpower. At the time, it was the most progressive and advanced nation on Earth. The dynasty's early leaders were powerful and pioneering. But as the years passed, enthusiasm waned. Corruption and neglect crept in. And in 1644, the Ming finally faltered. The vultures were already circling. Rebel forces invaded Beijing, and the city was laid to ruin. The dynasty was on its knees. When they broke into the Forbidden City, Emperor Chongjun, the last Ming emperor, had already committed suicide on a hill behind the palace. An empire had fallen, and the fate of the nation lay in the hands of the rebels. Wu Sangui, a general in the Ming army, devised a drastic solution. Controlling military troops at the Great Wall, he allowed the Manchus, a neighboring clan from the north, to pass through Ming defenses. In a traitorous move, Sangui shifted alliance and led a foreign Manchu army to defeat the rebels, allowing them control of Beijing and the power to establish a new dynasty. China would be ruled by a new royal family and was now to be known as the Ching Empire. They took up residence in the ready-made opulence of the Forbidden City and kept Beijing as their capital. A change of royal family meant a change in dynasty, well within the rules in imperial China. If the ruling family lost its grip on its empire, then an uprising from a rival clan was the best solution. This process resulted in many dynastic changes over 2,000 years of imperial rule, and kept those most able in charge of the nation. Much of the Forbidden City that now stands was constructed or rebuilt by the second royal dynasty to live in the palace. The leaders of the new Ching Empire understood that if their rule was to be accepted by the people, they should take control sensitively and maintain the status quo. They kept most of the original architecture of the Forbidden City and adopted many of the traditions of their predecessors in the running of their new empire. The secret residences remained just as mysterious under their new owners. The palace and life within its walls was still an enigma. The outer court was used for the emperor's public and ceremonial life. Behind it, the inner court was his home. Over 500 years, 24 emperors and their families lived in the most exclusive address in China. But with that privilege came responsibility. Like Yongle, every Chinese emperor was thought to be the son of heaven during his reign. So powerful that he could make the sun rise and crops grow. He held the fate of the whole nation in his hands. His authority was unquestionable, and his actions far-reaching. But even the Son of Heaven needed training. Crown princes were prepared for a life of both absolute power China needed to help run the vast empire. And they were recruited through grueling imperial examinations. Anyone could sit the tests. And those who passed became a member of the emperor's court, one of the most sought-after jobs in the country. The papers were the most challenging in China, with candidates left to complete the tests, isolated and uninterrupted, in a small room for 3 days. The hopefuls would be brought together in the outer court, in front of the emperor himself, to learn their results.
It was a little cold that day. At the 5th watch, just before the dawn, I, along with other candidates, knelt on the ground in front of the Taihe Hall. One day before, there was gossip around speculating who would become the principal graduate. All my hopes were gone. When the ceremony started, I heard that the candidate who came first in the examination was none other than me. Whenever my name was called, music played. I could not believe my own ears.
process that valued intellect above all else. Most emperors would hold morning court before daybreak, so officials would arrive outside the palace at 3 a.m. A drum was beaten, the signal to line up, before a bell marked that the gates were about to open. The men would take their spots according to rank. When the emperor arrived, they would kowtow in perfect unison, kneeling before him and touching their head to the ground in a display of respect. Some emperors were more dedicated to their duties than others. Emperor Kang Shi of the Qing Dynasty saw his officials almost daily. Whilst 100 years earlier, Ming Emperor Wan Li didn't hold court for over 20 years. Court officials had restricted access to the palace, only allowed in the outer court when summoned by the emperor. The only men from outside the royal family allowed into the Forbidden City's inner court effectively swapped their manhood for the privilege. An army of castrated men known as eunuchs were employed to help run the palace. Their genitals removed in an effort to safeguard the chastity of the imperial ladies. They were ingrained in royal life and involved at every level of running the palace. Despite the sacrifice, some men volunteered themselves for the job, especially when faced with a life of poverty. Others were forced by parents, tempted by a cash payment from the palace. For 2,000 years, eunuchs had been kept illiterate and away from power. But as imperial China reached its last 500 years, more progressive leaders set up a school for those living in the Forbidden City. Once able to read and write, palace eunuchs were liberated, and their rise to power proved unstoppable. Some emperors used the educated eunuchs to help balance the bureaucracy of the court officials. But instead, many became powerful political players themselves. Trusted eunuchs had unlimited access to the inner court to the emperor and his family. From this position, they were able to advise and manipulate from within. Even blocking top-level officials from accessing their ruler. By the mid-17th century, ambitious castrates had worked themselves into positions of absolute power. Some effectively held sway over the entire government. At this time, the Forbidden City employed more than 100,000 eunuchs. And the most trusted of all were allocated to the emperor's women. To help the emperor produce an heir, the world's largest harem was placed at his disposal. This gave the best odds that enough boys would make it to adulthood at a time when infant mortality was high. The complicated hierarchy of sometimes thousands of women, all vying for the affections of one man, was a system destined for drama. The Ching Emperor Kangxi kept his harem organized into distinct ranks. The Empress was the most important woman in the palace. The only other to rival her power was the mother of the emperor, the Empress Dowager. Below them was one imperial noble consort. She outranked 2 imperial consorts. Then there were 4 consorts, with 6 imperial concubines below them, and countless lower-ranking concubines at the bottom of the ladder. The sole task of everyone in the harem was to bear children for the emperor. Those who gave birth to boys were promoted. For emperor, empress, consorts, and concubines alike, the stakes were high. Success and security were measured by the production of an heir. Sons of the Empress were first in line for the throne, before the eldest son of all the concubines collectively. Recruiting women for the Forbidden City's harem was a complicated process. Social background was no barrier. Anyone could, in theory, be selected. But the high standards of the palace were unachievable to most. The country would be searched for its finest young women. When parents had to present their daughters, some as young as 13. Only the prettiest, healthiest, and most accomplished would be brought to the palace to be seen by the emperor. He would then have the final say on who would stay and join his harem. When girls entered the palace, they left their freedom at the gates. It it became a gilded prison. And most never left the confines of the inner court. Women were at the mercy of the emperor. And for the first 200 years of the Forbidden City's history, life as a concubine was particularly dangerous. Emperors were known to be cruel and violent. The Forbidden City's creator, Emperor Yongle, just days after the inauguration of the palace, discovered that his favorite consort was in love with a eunuch. Furious at this transgression, he ordered the execution of his entire harem. Some 2,500 women were stabbed to death by palace guards. But this wasn't the end of his brutality. The final punishment was served at his death. The women brought in to replace those killed were forced to hang themselves. In a final show of faith to their master. Other emperors were more subtle with their cruelty. Emperor Jundur, who rose to power in 1505, obsessively collected 9,000 women who were crammed into the inner court. Many are said to have starved to death. Emperors were in control of the bedchamber, and women were expected to oblige. At the end of each day, a card would be selected by the emperor. On it was written the name of the woman he had decided to spend the evening with. The chosen one would be carried by a eunuch to the emperor's bed, wrapped in nothing but silk. A safeguard to ensure against concealed weapons. No woman was allowed to spend the whole night with the emperor. Eunuchs would accompany them back to their sleeping quarters, and notes would then be taken on potential conceptions. Love was a rare and complicated thing in the palace, and harems were often brutal and tempestuous places. Competition for both the affections of the emperor and the production of an heir was known to drive women to violence. Lady Wan was an imperial concubine to Emperor Changhua, who ruled for 23 years from 1465. 17 years his senior, she had helped to raise him, but evolved from a mother figure to his favorite concubine. She even gave birth to his son, who later died. Fueled by jealousy and a hunger for power, Lady Wan murdered, aborted, or poisoned as many of the emperor's babies as she could, often killing their mothers in the process. She dominated the harem with her bitterness for nearly 2 decades. But one child was missed. Wan's fellow consort, Lady Ji, secretly gave birth to a boy. She knew that she would have to act quickly to save him, and entrusted her baby to a eunuch who helped to hide him deep within the inner court, to be raised away from the rest of the harem. When the emperor discovered the secret 5 years later, he immediately sent for the boy. As heir to the throne, Lady Wan couldn't get away with his murder now. But she did manage to kill his mother as a consolation. The young prince grew up to be the Hongzhou Emperor, China's first monogamous ruler. Given the drama and heartache dealt to him by the harem, he chose to give his love to just one woman. Hongzhou was the only emperor to have just one wife, but harems varied in size. While the largest contained almost 9,000 women, Emperor Guangxu had only an empress and 2 concubines. Guangxu selected his harem in 1899. It would be the smallest and the last of imperial China. Only 5 girls had passed the demanding physical and mental requirements. But Guangxu's final choices didn't count for much. His overpowering aunt, Empress Dowager Cixi, was calling the shots. A eunuch present at the time gave a description of what happened.
A jade handle and 2 pairs of embroidered pouches were prepared. The girl who received the jade handle would be the empress, and the girls who received the embroidered pouches would be the concubines of the emperor. With the jade handle in hand, Emperor Guangxu approached one of the girls and was about to hand it to her. At this very moment, Empress Dowager Cixi spoke loudly. "Emperor," she hinted that the jade handle should be given to a different girl. Guangxu had no choice.
Cixi had been the de facto ruler of China for decades, through control over 2 emperors, her powerless son, and now through her ineffective nephew. She knew that to retain her power, an obedient empress was crucial. Guangxu was forced to reject his first choice and instead pick a girl favored by his aunt. 2 other girls also joined the harem at this time. One of them, Junfei, was just 13 years old, but she was bold, intelligent, and beautiful. She quickly became the young emperor's favorite and was promoted to imperial concubine, elevating her power and status. She had the upper hand over the other women, and Dowager Cixi began to view her as a threat. Her response was brutal and swift. She ordered Junfei to commit suicide. And when she refused, Cixi commanded eunuchs to throw her down a well. rules were made by those in power, and it wasn't always the emperor who held it. Guangxu could have done little to help. He held no authority over his formidable aunt. He was merely a puppet emperor. It was Cixi who truly ruled China, and had been a towering presence over the Ching Empire for decades. By maintaining her dominance over the imperial house, she had become one of the most powerful women in the history of China. But she would bear witness to her empire's darkest days. China had been weakened by foreign powers, and in 1900, Beijing was in chaos. Imperial rule was floundering as rebels and foreign forces battled for control of the capital. The writing was on the wall for the royals. And, as if accepting their fate, in 1908, Emperor Guangxu became ill and died. Amazingly, Cixi followed him just one day later. She breathed her last, trying to save the doomed dynasty. The new child emperor, Pu Yi, was forced to abdicate just 3 years later, when rebels overthrew the government, bringing an end to 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. The Forbidden City had stood since its creation by Emperor Yongle for almost 500 years as the center of 2 dynasties. Its construction was one of the greatest achievements in Chinese history. Its impenetrable walls witnessed the unimaginable drama created by 24 extraordinary families, and held China's imperial secrets over the 5 centuries it stood as the royal home. The fall of the monarchy left the last abdicated emperor imprisoned in the Forbidden City. As the walls began to crumble around him, and a new China found its feet. The next few years would be some of the most turbulent the palace would witness, as its fate hung in the balance. After decades of uncertainty and neglect, the Forbidden City was to be given a new life and a new identity, restored to its former opulence. Forbidden and secret